Brimford Elementary was everything the Weston family had dreamed of, an elite school in a progressive neighborhood where their talented daughter Amara could finally thrive. When their daughter's behavior suddenly changed with her new teacher, her father Malik Weston's secret observation of the school cafeteria uncovered something that would shake him to his core. That day would forever change an innocent child's view of the world. Before we dive into this shocking story that will send shivers down your spine and make you think twice about who's really teaching in our schools, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The autumn air carried a crisp excitement as Malik and Jasmine Weston walked hand in hand up the concrete steps of Brimford Elementary School. The building's warm light spilled onto the manicured lawn, welcoming parents for the annual evening conference. Their footsteps echoed through the hallway, decorated with children's artwork, each piece a testament to the creative spirits that filled these classrooms daily. For the Westons, this wasn't just another parents' evening. It was a celebration of their decision to move to this affluent, diverse neighborhood 2 years ago. Here, in this progressive pocket of the city, they felt they'd finally found the perfect place to raise their daughter, Amara. The familiar scent of chalk and children's art supplies filled the air as they made their way to Amara's current classroom. Mrs. Thompson, Amara's teacher, greeted them with a genuine smile that reached her eyes. The couple settled into the small chairs at her desk, feeling slightly oversized but completely at ease. "Mr. and Mrs. Weston," Mrs. Thompson began, shuffling through her papers with obvious enthusiasm, "I cannot express enough how much of a joy it has been having Amara in my class this year." She pulled out a folder filled with Amara's work, spreading out colorful papers covered in neat handwriting and complex math problems. "Amara isn't just excelling academically," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice warm with pride. "She's consistently at the top of her class in both mathematics and reading comprehension. But what truly sets her apart is her leadership ability. The other children naturally gravitate toward her during group activities." Malik and Jasmine exchanged proud glances as Mrs. Thompson shared story after story of Amara's achievements. Their daughter's analytical mind, her kindness toward classmates, her natural curiosity, each detail confirmed what they already knew about their little girl, while filling them with renewed pride. "Just last week," Mrs. Thompson added, "Amara organized a study group for our multiplication tables. She noticed some of her classmates struggling and took it upon herself to help them. That's the kind of student she is, always thinking of others while pushing herself to excel." As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson's eyes grew slightly misty. "I'm going to miss having Amara in my class," she admitted, "but I know she'll continue to shine bright in her new classroom." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A woman with shoulder-length blonde-grey hair entered, her smile broad and welcoming. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, "but I heard the Westons were here and I just had to introduce myself." Mrs. Thompson brightened. "Oh, perfect timing. Mr. and Mrs. Weston, this is Susan Miller. She'll be Amara's teacher starting tomorrow." Susan Miller stepped forward, extending her hand warmly. "I've heard so many wonderful things about Amara," she said, her voice filled with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "Mrs. Thompson has been singing her praises in the teacher's lounge for months. I can't wait to have such a bright young mind in my classroom." Malik and Jasmine felt their hearts lighten even further. Susan Miller had an air of competence and kindness about her that immediately put them at ease. She spoke about her teaching philosophy, her excitement for the upcoming term, and her plans to nurture each student's individual talents. "Amara's academic record is impressive," Mrs. Miller said, "but what really excites me is hearing about her leadership qualities. We'll be doing a lot of group projects this term, and I think she'll really thrive in that environment." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Miller's parting words lingered in the air. "I can't wait to see Amara tomorrow. I just know we're going to have an amazing year together." Walking out of the school building, Malik and Jasmine felt a deep sense of contentment. The evening had confirmed everything they'd hoped for when they chose this school: dedicated teachers, a nurturing environment, and a place where their daughter could truly flourish. The drive home was filled with animated conversation about Amara's achievements. As they pulled into their driveway, the warm glow from their porch light welcomed them home, where their daughter waited eagerly for news about the meeting. Amara sat cross-legged on the living room couch, her favorite book temporarily forgotten as her parents entered. At 10 years old, she was already showing signs of the remarkable young woman she would become, intelligent, compassionate, and full of curiosity about the world around her. "So?" she asked, bouncing slightly on the cushions. "What did Mrs. Thompson say about me?" Malik scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around as she giggled. "Only that you're the most amazing student she's ever had," he declared, setting her down gently. "Really?" Amara's eyes widened with delight. "Really?" Jasmine confirmed, running her fingers through their daughter's braids. "And guess what? We met your new teacher too. Mrs. Miller seems wonderful." The family moved to Amara's room, where they spent the evening together. Amara showed them her latest art projects and the book report she'd been working on. Her room was a testament to her personality. Walls lined with bookshelves, a desk covered in science projects, and a collection of awards from various academic competitions. "I can't wait to start in Mrs. Miller's class tomorrow," Amara said, sitting on her bed clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. "Jenny told me they do lots of cool science experiments, and they're starting a new book next week that's supposed to be really good." As bedtime approached, Malik and Jasmine tucked their daughter in, their hearts full of pride and hope for her future. After kissing her goodnight, they retired to their own room, where they could finally discuss the evening in private. "Remember when we first moved here?" Jasmine asked, settling onto their bed. "How worried we were about making the right choice." Malik nodded, his expression growing serious for a moment. After what happened at her old school, he trailed off, remembering the bullying incident that had prompted their move. The memory of Amara coming home in tears, targeted because of her race, still made his blood boil. "But look at her now," Jasmine said quickly, reaching for his hand. "She's thriving here. The school is everything we hoped for. Diverse, welcoming, challenging, and did you see how many other children of color were represented in the artwork on the walls?" "You're right," Malik agreed, his tension easing. "This place is different, better. We made the right choice moving here, even if it meant taking on a bigger mortgage and longer commutes to work. Seeing her so happy and successful, it makes everything worth it." They talked late into the night about their daughter's future, about the opportunities that seemed to be opening up before her, and about their gratitude for finding this welcoming community. Neither of them could have imagined that their sense of security was about to be shattered in the most horrifying way possible. Monday morning arrived with the kind of golden sunshine that seemed to promise good things ahead. Amara was up early, her school uniform pressed and perfect, her backpack packed and ready by the door. She practically bounced through breakfast, barely able to contain her excitement about starting in Mrs. Miller's class. "Did you remember to pack your homework folder?" Jasmine asked, though she already knew the answer. Amara was nothing if not organized. "Yes, Mom," Amara replied, patting her backpack, "and my math workbook for study group, and the permission slip for the science museum trip next week." Malik watched his daughter from over his coffee cup, his heart swelling with pride. She was so ready for this new challenge, so eager to learn and grow. It amazed him sometimes how much of a perfect blend she was of both him and Jasmine, his analytical mind combined with her mother's artistic soul. The familiar rumble of the approaching school bus drew them all to the front door. Amara hugged both her parents tightly, her backpack already secured over her shoulders. "Have a great first day, Princess," Malik said, straightening her collar one last time. "Show them how brilliant you are," Jasmine added, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead. They watched as Amara bounded down the driveway, her braids bouncing with each step. She climbed aboard the bus, immediately spotting her friend Jenny and waving enthusiastically to her parents through the window. As the bus pulled away, Malik and Jasmine stood arm in arm, watching until it disappeared around the corner. "Remember when we first moved here?" Malik asked, leading Jasmine back inside. "How nervous we were about everything." Jasmine nodded, settling onto their porch swing. They'd both taken the day off work, wanting to be fully present for Amara's first day in her new class. "It was such a leap of faith," she replied, "leaving our old neighborhood, taking on the bigger mortgage." "But look at us now," Malik said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "In a safe neighborhood with good schools, where Amara can just be herself without worrying about—" He trailed off, not wanting to revisit the painful memories of their old neighborhood. "Without worrying about the things we had to worry about growing up," Jasmine finished for him. She squeezed his hand, understanding the unspoken words. They'd both faced their share of discrimination and prejudice in their lives, but here, in this progressive, diverse community, they finally felt like they could breathe easier. The morning stretched out before them, peaceful and promising. They spent it doing small projects around the house and talking about their hopes for Amara's future. Neither of them could have imagined that in just a few hours their world would be turned upside down, and their faith in their chosen community would be shattered in the most horrifying way possible. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Westons' backyard as Malik fired up the grill. He'd decided to make Amara's favorite, grilled chicken with honey glaze, to celebrate her first day in the new class. Jasmine lounged nearby in a garden chair, working on her laptop, but mostly enjoying the warm weather and peaceful atmosphere. "What time does the bus usually get here?" Malik asked, checking his watch. "Any minute now," Jasmine replied, closing her laptop. "You know how precise Mrs. Rodriguez is with her route." Sure enough, they soon heard the familiar sound of the school bus stopping at the corner of their street. They could hear children's voices and laughter floating on the breeze, the normal sounds of another school day ending. Jasmine sat up straighter in her chair, setting aside her work completely. "There comes our little princess," she called out cheerfully, as Amara's figure appeared at the end of the driveway. "Tell us how your day was, honey." But something was wrong. Instead of running to the backyard as she usually did, bursting with stories about her day, Amara walked straight past the garden gate. Her head was down, her shoulders hunched, a posture so unlike their normally confident daughter that both parents felt an immediate stab of concern. The sound of the front door closing, followed by Amara's footsteps heading directly to her room, broke the stunned silence that had fallen over the backyard. Malik and Jasmine exchanged worried glances. "That's not like her at all," Malik said, already moving to turn off the grill. "Maybe she's just overwhelmed," Jasmine suggested, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. First days can be stressful, even for kids who are usually confident. They stood in the garden for a few moments, both trying to convince themselves that this was normal behavior for a child adjusting to a new situation. But deep down, they knew better. This wasn't their Amara, their bright, talkative, enthusiastic daughter, who normally couldn't wait to share every detail of her day. "Should we check on her?" Malik asked, though it was clear from his tone that he'd already decided to do so. "Let's give her a few minutes," Jasmine advised, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "If something did happen, she might need some time to process it first." But as they waited in the garden, trying to carry on with their original plans while stealing worried glances at Amara's window, both parents felt an increasing sense of unease. Something had changed their daughter during her first day in Mrs. Miller's class, and neither of them could shake the feeling that it was something serious. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 15 minutes, Malik and Jasmine couldn't wait any longer. They made their way to Amara's room, their footsteps heavy with concern. Malik knocked gently on the door. "Amara, princess, can we come in?" There was a moment of silence, then a quiet, "Okay." They entered to find Amara lying on her bed, facing away from the door, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant, something she hadn't done since she was much younger. The sight made their hearts ache. Their daughter only reverted to seeking comfort from her old toys when something was seriously wrong. Jasmine sat carefully on the edge of the bed, while Malik pulled up Amara's desk chair. "Sweetheart," Jasmine began gently, "did something happen at school today?" Amara's shoulders tensed visibly, but she didn't turn around. "It was just stressful," she mumbled into her pillow. Malik leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "What kind of stress, Princess? You can tell us anything, you know that, right?" Finally, Amara rolled over to face them, and they could see the tear tracks on her cheeks. The sight made Malik's stomach clench. Their daughter wasn't one to cry easily. She was usually the one comforting other kids when they were upset. Amara started, then stopped, biting her lip. "I just want to be alone for a little while, please." Jasmine stroked her daughter's hair, noting how Amara seemed to flinch slightly at the touch. "Are you sure you don't want to talk about it? Sometimes sharing what's bothering us can make it feel better." But Amara just shook her head, turning away again. "Not right now. Maybe later." Malik and Jasmine shared a concerned look. This wasn't like their daughter at all. Amara had always been open with them, sharing everything from playground disputes to academic challenges. This withdrawal, this reluctance to communicate, it was completely out of character. "Okay, sweetheart," Jasmine said finally, standing up. "We'll give you some space, but we're here whenever you want to talk, all right?" As they left the room, closing the door softly behind them, Malik felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. The same feeling he'd had years ago when Amara was being bullied at her old school. But this was supposed to be different. This was Brimford Elementary in their safe, progressive neighborhood. This was supposed to be better. In the hallway, Jasmine touched his arm. "She's probably just overwhelmed," she whispered, trying to sound convincing. "New teacher, new classmates, new expectations. It's a lot for a child to handle." But Malik couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play. He'd seen that look in his daughter's eyes before, and it wasn't the look of a child struggling with normal school stress. It was the look of someone who had encountered something they weren't prepared to handle, something that had shaken their faith in the world around them. The evening progressed with an unusual tension hanging in the air. Malik had finished grilling the chicken, though his earlier enthusiasm for the celebratory meal had dampened considerably. Jasmine set the table, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite their growing concerns. To their surprise, just as they were about to call her, Amara emerged from her room and made her way to the dinner table. She sat down quietly, her eyes fixed on her plate, none of her usual chatter about wanting to help set the table or serve the food. "Are you feeling a bit better, Princess?" Malik asked, trying to keep his tone light as he served her a piece of the honey-glazed chicken, usually her favorite. Amara nodded vaguely but didn't elaborate. As they began eating, both parents noticed something unusual about their daughter's behavior. She was eating with an intensity they'd never seen before, almost as if she hadn't eaten all day. The chicken disappeared from her plate at an alarming rate, and she immediately reached for seconds, then thirds. "Wow, you must have worked up quite an appetite today," Malik said, trying to inject some humor into the situation. "You're eating like you're starving, kiddo." But instead of smiling at her father's gentle teasing as she normally would, Amara just continued eating mechanically, her face expressionless. Her fork moved from plate to mouth with an almost robotic regularity, her eyes never leaving her food. Jasmine attempted to spark conversation, asking about her new classroom, her desk placement, her new classmates, all the usual first-day topics that would normally have Amara chattering excitedly. But each question was met with one-word answers or vague mumbles. "Did you get to do any fun activities with Mrs. Miller today?" Jasmine tried again. At the mention of Mrs. Miller's name, Amara's fork clattered against her plate. For a brief moment, her composure cracked, and both parents caught a glimpse of something that looked like fear in their daughter's eyes. But before either could comment, she had gathered herself again. "May I be excused?" Amara asked quietly, her plate clean for the third time. "I'm really tired." "Of course, sweetheart," Jasmine responded, exchanging another worried glance with Malik. "Do you want me to come tuck you in?" "No, thank you," Amara replied, already pushing back her chair. I can do it myself." They watched as their daughter walked away, her shoulders still hunched, her usual bouncing step replaced by a slower, more hesitant gait. As soon as they heard her bedroom door close, Malik turned to Jasmine. "Something's wrong," he said firmly. "This isn't normal first-day jitters. You saw how she reacted when you mentioned Mrs. Miller's name." Jasmine began clearing the plates, her movements betraying her anxiety. "Maybe we're reading too much into this," she suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "You know how Amara is. She puts so much pressure on herself to be perfect. Maybe she's just worried about living up to Mrs. Miller's expectations after all the praise she got from Mrs. Thompson." "No," Malik shook his head, his jaw set. "This is different. Did you see how she was eating, like she hadn't seen food all day, and that look in her eyes?" He trailed off, remembering the flash of fear he'd glimpsed. "What are you thinking?" Jasmine asked, setting down the plates and turning to face her husband. "I'm thinking about what happened at her old school," Malik said quietly. "How long it took her to tell us about the bullying. How she tried to handle it all by herself until it got too much to bear." "But this is Brimford," Jasmine protested. "We chose this neighborhood, this school, specifically because it's different. Mrs. Miller seemed so kind at the meeting yesterday." "Sometimes people aren't what they seem," Malik responded, his voice heavy with past experience. "And sometimes the worst things happen in the places where you least expect them." They spent the rest of the evening in troubled conversation, their voices low to avoid disturbing Amara. When they finally went to check on her before heading to bed themselves, they found her already asleep, still clutching her stuffed elephant, her face troubled even in slumber. That night, Malik lay awake long after Jasmine had fallen asleep. His mind kept replaying every detail of the evening: Amara's unusual behavior, her ravenous appetite, the fear in her eyes at the mention of Mrs. Miller's name. Something wasn't adding up, and the familiar protective instinct that had served him well in the past was screaming at him to act. He thought back to their old neighborhood, to how long it had taken them to realize what Amara was going through. By the time they discovered the extent of the bullying, their daughter had already suffered in silence for months. He'd promised himself then that he would never let her down like that again. As the first light of dawn began to creep through their bedroom window, Malik made his decision. He couldn't sit back and wait for Amara to tell them what was wrong. He needed to find out for himself. Getting up quietly, he went through his morning routine earlier than usual. When Jasmine stirred, he was already dressed for work. "I thought I'd drive Amara to school today," he said casually when Jasmine gave him a questioning look. "Give her some extra support, you know." Jasmine smiled, touched by what she perceived as a father's thoughtful gesture. "That's sweet of you, honey. I'm sure she'll appreciate it." But Malik had no intention of going to work after dropping Amara off. He'd already sent an email to his office saying he'd be taking another personal day. His real plan was to stay at the school and observe, to figure out what was causing his daughter's distress. As they ate breakfast, Malik watched Amara carefully. She seemed slightly less tense than the previous evening, but still not herself. When he offered to drive her to school, she accepted with a quiet, "Okay." None of her usual excitement about getting to spend extra time with her dad. The drive to school was mostly silent. Malik tried to engage Amara in conversation, but she remained withdrawn, staring out the window as the familiar streets of their neighborhood passed by. As they approached the school, he noticed her beginning to fidget with the strap of her backpack, a nervous habit she'd developed during the bullying at her old school. "You know you can tell me anything, right, Princess?" he said as they pulled up to the school drop-off area. "Anything at all?" Amara looked at him then, and for a moment he thought she might open up, but instead she just nodded, gave him a quick hug and got out of the car. He watched as she walked toward the school entrance, noticing how she seemed to hesitate slightly before going inside. Instead of pulling away from the curb, Malik waited until most of the other parents had left, then found a parking spot with a clear view of both the playground and the cafeteria windows. He sent a quick text to Jasmine saying he'd made it to work safely, then settled in for what he hoped would be an uneventful day of observation. Little did he know that in just a few hours he would uncover something far more disturbing than anything he could have imagined. From his vantage point in the parking lot, Malik had a clear view of the school's main areas. He'd positioned his car carefully, close enough to see clearly, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. As a parent, his presence wouldn't raise immediate suspicion, but he still needed to be careful. The morning passed slowly. Through the large windows, he could occasionally catch glimpses of students moving between classrooms. During the first recess, he watched intently as children poured onto the playground. His heart lifted slightly when he spotted Amara with a small group of friends, apparently engaged in their usual games. She was smiling, laughing even, as she played jump rope with two other girls. To any casual observer, she would have appeared perfectly normal, just another happy child enjoying recess with her friends. But Malik noticed the subtle signs that others might miss. How her laughter seemed to fade too quickly, how her eyes kept darting toward the school building, how she stayed closer to the playground's edges rather than joining the larger groups in the center, as she usually did. Still, there was no obvious sign of bullying or mistreatment. No other students were avoiding her or treating her unkindly. If anything, her classmates seemed to seek out her company, just as Mrs. Thompson had described during the parent-teacher conference. As the morning wore on, Malik found himself growing increasingly puzzled. He'd expected to see something, some interaction or incident that would explain Amara's behavior the previous evening. But everything appeared normal on the surface. Too normal, perhaps. He checked his phone, responding to a few work emails to maintain the illusion that he was at the office. Jasmine had sent a text asking how his day was going, and he felt a twinge of guilt as he replied with a vague, "All good here." He hated being dishonest with her, but he knew she would worry if she knew what he was doing. As lunchtime approached, Malik's attention sharpened. He remembered Amara's unusual appetite at dinner the night before, how she'd eaten as if she'd been starving. Could something be happening during lunch? Were other students taking her food? Was she being prevented from eating? The timing of the lunch periods was something he knew well. Amara had often talked about how her class had the second lunch period right after the third graders. As he watched the first group of students file into the cafeteria, Malik made a decision. Simply observing from outside wasn't enough. He needed to get closer to see exactly what was happening during lunch. He checked his watch. 11:45 a.m. Amara's lunch period would begin in 15 minutes. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car, straightened his tie, and walked toward the school building. As Malik approached the school's main entrance, he forced himself to appear casual, nodding to a passing teacher who recognized him from the previous evening's parent conference. The familiar scent of school cafeteria food wafted through the hallways, a mix of warming bread rolls and something that was probably supposed to be spaghetti sauce. He made his way toward the cafeteria, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty hallway. The first lunch period was just ending, and he could hear the chaos of children clearing their trays and lining up to return to class. He waited around the corner, not wanting to draw attention to himself until Amara's class arrived for the second lunch period. As he waited, his mind raced through possibilities. Maybe some kids were stealing her lunch money, or perhaps she was being pressured to give away her food. But none of these scenarios seemed to fit with what he knew about Brimford Elementary, or with Amara's apparent interaction with her classmates during recess. The sound of approaching footsteps and children's voices signaled the arrival of the second lunch period. Malik watched as various classes filed into the cafeteria, finally spotting Amara's class among them. His daughter walked in line with her classmates, but something about her demeanor seemed off. While other children chatted excitedly about lunch, Amara kept her head down, almost trying to make herself invisible. Making sure to stay back far enough not to be immediately noticed, Malik positioned himself where he could observe the lunch line. He watched as students moved through, receiving their trays of food. Everything seemed normal at first, the usual array of elementary school lunch options being served to each child. Then Amara reached the front of the line. What happened next made Malik's blood run cold. Instead of receiving the same lunch as her classmates, he watched as Mrs. Miller herself appeared, seemingly from nowhere, and stepped behind the serving counter. She spoke quietly to the lunch staff, who looked confused but stepped aside. Then, with what appeared to be a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she personally served something onto Amara's tray, something that looked nothing like what the other children were receiving. Just as mysteriously as she had appeared, Mrs. Miller vanished again, leaving the regular cafeteria staff to resume their duties. Malik frowned, his unease growing. Why would a teacher suddenly appear just to serve food to one specific student? And why his daughter? Unable to contain himself any longer, Malik moved closer to the cafeteria entrance. From his new vantage point, he could see Amara sitting alone at a table near the back of the room. The sight of his usually sociable daughter in isolation was concerning enough, but what he saw on her lunch tray made his stomach lurch. There, in the center of the tray, was what appeared to be a fried frog. Not a French fried potato, not a chicken nugget, but an actual frog, its legs splayed out grotesquely on the plastic tray. Malik felt his hands begin to shake with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He watched as his daughter sat there, head bowed, not touching the revolting meal before her. Around her, other students ate their normal lunches, plates of spaghetti, salads, and sandwiches. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Unable to stand by any longer, Malik strode into the cafeteria. "Amara," he called out, his voice trembling slightly with controlled anger. His daughter's head snapped up at the sound of his voice. For a moment she looked terrified, not of him, but of being discovered in this situation. Then, as recognition set in, her face crumpled. She jumped up from her seat and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face in his shirt. Malik could feel her small body trembling as he held her. "Baby, what's going on here?" he asked, though he already had a sickening suspicion. "Who gave you this food?" Amara's voice was barely a whisper, muffled against his shirt. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice catching. She said this is what our kind eats." The words hit Malik like a physical blow. He looked again at the grotesque meal on the tray, then at his daughter's tear-stained face, and felt something inside him break. All the trust they'd placed in this school, all the belief that they'd found a safe place for their daughter, it all came crashing down in that moment. Here, in their supposedly progressive neighborhood, in their carefully chosen school, their 10-year-old daughter had been subjected to an act of racism so blatant, so cruel, that it took his breath away. And it had come not from other children, but from a teacher, someone who was supposed to protect and nurture his child. Looking around the cafeteria, he noticed other students beginning to stare, some with confusion, others with what appeared to be guilt on their faces, as if they'd known something was wrong but had been too afraid or uncertain to speak up. The reality of the situation hit him full force. This hadn't been a one-time incident. The previous day's behavior, Amara's ravenous appetite at dinner, her reluctance to talk about school, it all made horrible sense now. His daughter had been subjected to this treatment for 2 days, suffering in silence, just as she had at her old school. But this time things would be different. This time he was here to witness it firsthand, and he would make sure there were consequences. With hands shaking from barely controlled rage, Malik pulled out his phone. He could feel Amara still clutching his waist, her small frame trembling against him. The cafeteria had grown eerily quiet, the normal lunch-hour chaos replaced by whispers and stares. Dialing 911, Malik kept one arm protectively around his daughter. When the operator answered, he fought to keep his voice steady. "I need to report a hate crime at Brimford Elementary School," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet cafeteria. "A teacher is deliberately serving my black daughter inedible food and making racist comments. I need officers here immediately." The operator's voice was professional and calm. "Officers are being dispatched to your location, sir. Please stay where you are. They should arrive within minutes." After ending the call, Malik knelt down to Amara's level, looking into her eyes. "Princess, I need you to come with me, okay? We're going to wait in the car until the police arrive." Amara nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. As they turned to leave the cafeteria, Malik noticed several students had pulled out their phones, presumably recording the scene. Good, he thought. Let there be evidence. Daddy, Amara whispered as they walked through the hallway. I'm sorry I didn't tell you yesterday. Malik's heart clenched. No, baby, he said firmly, squeezing her hand. You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing that happened here is your fault. Nothing. As they reached his car in the parking lot, Malik helped Amara into the passenger seat. He could see she was still shaking, so he grabbed the emergency blanket from his trunk and wrapped it around her shoulders. Stay here, Princess, he said, making sure she was secure. I need to go back inside and talk to some people, but I promise I'll be where you can see me through the windows the whole time, okay? Amara nodded, clutching the blanket around herself. Are they going to make Mrs. Miller leave? She asked in a small voice. Yes, Malik answered firmly. She's never going to hurt you or any other child again, I promise. As he closed the car door, Malik took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The rage he'd been containing threatened to boil over, but he knew he needed to stay in control. For Amara's sake, he had to handle this the right way. With determined steps, Malik strode back into the school building. The hallways were eerily quiet now, with most students still in the cafeteria or their classrooms. He made his way directly to the principal's office, where he found the secretary already on the phone, presumably having been alerted to the situation. I need to speak with Principal Roberts immediately, Malik stated, his voice firm but controlled. And I need someone to bring me to Mrs. Miller's classroom. The secretary, looking flustered, quickly ended her call. Mr. Weston, Principal Roberts is already on his way to meet you. He should be here any... As if on cue, Principal Roberts rounded the corner, his face grave. Mr. Weston, he began, I've just been informed of a situation in the cafeteria. Take me to Mrs. Miller's classroom, Malik interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Now. The principal hesitated for just a moment before nodding. Follow me, he said, leading the way down the hallway. They found Mrs. Miller in her classroom, calmly arranging papers on her desk as if it were any other school day. When they entered, she barely looked up, her face wearing an expression of mild annoyance at the interruption. Mrs. Miller, Malik said, his voice trembling with contained fury, I want you to explain why you served my daughter a fried frog for lunch. Mrs. Miller's response was chilling in its casualness. She smirked slightly, still not making eye contact. Can you please get out of my classroom? I'm working. The dismissive tone, the complete lack of acknowledgement of what she'd done, it was almost more than Malik could bear. His fists clenched at his sides as he fought to maintain his composure. Working, he repeated, his voice rising slightly. Is that what you call deliberately terrorizing a 10-year-old child? Is that what you call forcing my daughter to go hungry while making racist comments about what our kind eats? Mrs. Miller finally looked up, her expression cold and unchanged. Mr. Weston, I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. Now, if you'll excuse me... No, Malik cut her off, taking a step forward. I will not excuse you. I will not excuse this blatant racism. I will not excuse you traumatizing my child. And I certainly will not excuse your attempts to pretend this isn't happening. Principal Roberts, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke up. Mrs. Miller, these are very serious accusations. We need to... But before he could finish, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway. The police had arrived. 2 officers appeared in the doorway of the classroom, their presence immediately changing the dynamic of the room. One was a middle-aged white officer with graying hair at his temples, while the other was a younger black officer who introduced himself as Officer Jordan. We received a call about a potential hate crime, the older officer stated, looking around the room. Who's Mr. Weston? That's me, Malik stepped forward, struggling to keep his voice steady. I'm the one who called about my daughter, Amara. The older officer pulled out a notepad. Can you explain what happened? Malik began recounting the events, from Amara's unusual behavior the previous evening to his discovery in the cafeteria. As he spoke, he noticed Mrs. Miller's smirk growing slightly, especially when the older officer's expression showed hints of skepticism. "So you're saying this teacher deliberately served your daughter a fried frog?" the older officer asked, his tone suggesting disbelief. "And made racist comments about it?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Malik insisted, his frustration growing. "My daughter is sitting in my car right now, traumatized, after being subjected to this woman's racism for 2 days. The older officer turned to Mrs. Miller. "Ma'am, what's your response to these allegations?" Mrs. Miller's face transformed into a mask of innocent concern. "This is completely ridiculous," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "I would never do something like that. Mr. Weston is clearly overreacting to what was probably a simple misunderstanding." Malik felt his heart rate spike at her casual dismissal of the situation. He could see the older officer already beginning to nod, along with Mrs. Miller's version of events, and for a moment he felt the same helpless rage he'd experienced so many times before when facing systemic racism. But then Officer Jordan spoke up. "Mr. Weston," Officer Jordan said, his voice calm but authoritative, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Malik followed Officer Jordan into the hallway, leaving Mrs. Miller with the other officer and Principal Roberts. As soon as they were out of earshot, Officer Jordan's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Tell me everything again," he said quietly. "Every detail, no matter how small." Something in the officer's tone told Malik that he was truly being heard for the first time. He recounted everything again: Amara's behavior changes, his surveillance, and the horrifying discovery in the cafeteria. "You said there's still evidence in the cafeteria?" Officer Jordan asked. "Yes," Malik replied. "The tray should still be there, and there were students recording on their phones." Officer Jordan nodded grimly. "Show me." They walked to the cafeteria, which had been cleared of students but not yet cleaned. On the table where Amara had been sitting, the tray still sat with its grotesque contents undisturbed. Officer Jordan took photos with his department-issued camera, his face growing increasingly serious as he documented the evidence. "This is," he started, then stopped, shaking his head in disgust. "This is beyond unacceptable." He radioed his partner to join them in the cafeteria. When the older officer arrived and saw the evidence for himself, his earlier skepticism began to fade. The reality of what they were dealing with couldn't be denied when faced with such concrete proof. "There's more," Officer Jordan said, addressing his partner. "We need to interview the cafeteria staff and get access to any security footage, and we need statements from students who witnessed this." The older officer nodded, his professional training taking over now that there was clear evidence of wrongdoing. Together they returned to Mrs. Miller's classroom, where her smug demeanor began to crack as she realized the tide had turned. "Susan Miller," Officer Jordan announced, "you're under arrest for committing a hate crime. You have the right to remain silent." As Mrs. Miller was led away in handcuffs, her previous composure completely shattered. She began protesting loudly, her true nature finally showing through the facade of professional respectability she'd hidden behind. Malik watched as she was escorted out of the building, feeling a complex mix of emotions: relief that she was being held accountable, rage at what she'd done to his daughter, and deep sadness that such hatred could exist in a place where children should feel safe. The drive home was silent, with Amara still wrapped in the emergency blanket in the passenger seat. Malik had called Jasmine from the school, and she was already waiting in the driveway when they arrived, her face etched with worry and anger. As soon as Amara saw her mother, she ran into her arms, finally letting out all the tears she'd been holding back. Jasmine held her tightly, looking over their daughter's head at Malik with questions in her eyes. Once inside, they sat together in the living room, as Malik explained everything: his surveillance, the discovery, and Mrs. Miller's arrest. With each detail, Jasmine's expression shifted between horror, anger, and profound sadness. "Why didn't you tell us yesterday, baby?" Jasmine asked gently, stroking Amara's hair. I thought maybe I deserved it," Amara whispered, causing both parents' hearts to break. Mrs. Miller said that's what people like us eat, and I thought maybe I was being too sensitive, like at the old school. No, Princess, Malik said firmly, kneeling in front of his daughter. You never deserved this. What Mrs. Miller did was wrong, completely, totally wrong, and it says nothing about you and everything about her. Jasmine pulled Amara closer. You are perfect exactly as you are, she said, her voice thick with emotion, and you never have to accept anyone treating you like you're less than the amazing person you are. Malik felt a deep guilt weighing on him. I'm sorry we didn't realize sooner, he said. I'm sorry you had to go through this at all. Later that night, after Amara had finally fallen asleep, Malik and Jasmine sat in their kitchen, cups of untouched coffee growing cold between them. The events of the day felt surreal, like a nightmare they couldn't quite shake off. I can't believe this happened here, Jasmine said, her voice hollow. We thought we'd found somewhere safe, somewhere better. Malik reached across the table to take her hand. We did what we thought was best, he said softly. We couldn't have known. But that's just it, isn't it? Jasmine replied, tears forming in her eyes. We can never really know. We can move to the best neighborhood, choose the best school, do everything right and still have to face the reality that racism can exist anywhere, Malik finished, even in places that claim to be progressive and inclusive. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Finally, Jasmine spoke again, her voice stronger. What do we do now? We fight, Malik said firmly. We make sure Mrs. Miller faces consequences for what she did. We make sure the school implements real changes to prevent this from happening to any other child. And most importantly, we help Amara heal from this. And we stay, Jasmine added. We don't let them drive us away. We show Amara that we can face this together, that we don't have to run. Malik nodded, squeezing her hand. We show her that she's stronger than their hatred, and that she'll always have us in her corner. As they sat there in their kitchen, holding hands across the table, they knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal battles, difficult conversations, and the long process of helping their daughter rebuild her sense of security and self-worth. But they also knew that they would face it together, as a family. They would turn this horrible experience into a lesson about standing up for what's right, about not letting hatred win, and about the importance of speaking out against injustice. Most importantly, they would make sure Amara knew that she was loved, valued, and worthy of respect, not despite who she was, but because of who she was. And they would continue to fight for a world where no child would have to face what she had faced, where the promise of safety and equality wasn't just a facade hiding deeper prejudices.